At the end of 1944, along the Luxembourg border, the snow was repeatedly crushed under an iron-grey sky, scattered through the mud like silent shards of glass. For the first time, Weiss Hanna understood that collapse was not just a word in a war bulletin, but a chill that climbed from the soles of her feet all the way up her spine. She had served 2 years in the Wehrmacht Medical Auxiliary Corps, yet never before had she so clearly felt herself being thrown aside by the times. The aid station where she had been posted was supposed to withdraw in an orderly fashion with the unit, but when the 7th Air Raid blew the makeshift tents into the sky like scraps of paper, all that order was torn apart in an instant. She and 2 other auxiliaries were forced to drag the still movable wounded toward the edge of the woods, shells knocking splinters of snow off the trees, the air filled with the stench of burning canvas. That was not combat. That was flight. Flight had no direction and no orders. On the first night after the rout, they tried to rejoin the main German forces, but the roads had been torn into broken ribbons by shelling. The convoys were in chaos, command had broken down, and dozens of soldiers were shouting in different directions. No one cared anymore where 3 medical auxiliaries ended up. Hanna dragged a signalman with a thigh wound through the mud, and every time she lifted her boots, it felt as if she were pulling her legs free of quicksand. By dawn of the 2nd day, after being forced to march for hours on foot, they were completely exhausted. Their food had shrunk to half a piece of stale bread issued the day before, and even that piece had been repeatedly vomited up and forced back down by a feverish, wounded man. The true despair, however, was not hunger. It was the collapse of any sense of direction. In the training system of the Reich, she had been taught that the German army always has a rear, that you can always find your company. But in those days on the Western Front, the reality was this. The rear was crumbling, companies were dissolving, lines of communication were being blown apart again and again, and the map had become a meaningless disk of paper. They wandered lost in the forest for a full 8 hours before they encountered a German infantry covering detachment that was itself being shattered. The covering party did not rescue them. Instead, they shoved the 3 auxiliaries further out towards the outer line of defense. "You go that way. Don't block the way." That order felt more like humiliation than the shell fire did. For the first time, she truly felt that she was not a soldier, but a discarded component tossed out of the war machine. On the 3rd day, the temperature dropped below freezing. She began to show mild signs of hypothermia, her fingertips numb, her lips purple, the soles of her feet feeling as if invisible knives were slashing them in the snow. She had not eaten her fill in 2 days. Every movement was driven by habit rather than will. By late morning, the local village militia captured the 3 of them, now simply stragglers. The militiamen did not beat them, only waved their guns and shouted, driving them toward the road at the edge of the village. Hanna was so weak she could hardly see their faces. She only remembered the wind wrenching open her coat, while the cold poured into her bones like water. When she was handed over to American military police, she did not even have the strength to react to the concept of being taken prisoner. Exhaustion had shredded all shame and dignity. She no longer had the energy to imagine what a war crimes tribunal would be like. She only wanted water, a fire to warm her feet, and an end to walking. She and the other prisoners were brought to a temporary holding point and made to stand in line for 3 hours in the mud waiting for registration. Her feet had long since lost all sensation. During those hours, her only thought was, "If I fall now, I will never wake up again." When she was transferred to the harbour, she once more reached the limit of collapse. The wind on the docks was 10 times colder than in the forest, the sea air sharp with a metallic reek. She was forced to stand in the teeth of the wind for nearly 2 hours while waiting to board, the cold air cracking the skin on the backs of her hands. She trembled as if even her bones were shaking. At one point she wanted to lean against the wooden fence and close her eyes, but the military police kept urging the line, "Keep moving." She could feel her consciousness receding inch by inch, the world veiled as if behind fog. Once on the transport ship, she no longer had the strength to walk. She inched her way along the railing into the hatch. That day she had drunk only a single mouthful of cold water and eaten only a few crumbs of bread she had scraped out of her uniform pocket, hard as pebbles. Her stomach burned, hollow to the point of pain, yet unable either to hold anything or to throw it up. More cruel still was the fact that she had no idea where she was being sent, nor whether there was any possibility of returning to Germany. By the time she reached American soil, she could hardly be described as Wehrmacht personnel anymore. She was more like a person ground down by a long, relentless flight, sliding helplessly toward the edge of death. I shouldn't die like this in an enemy country. She had tried to think that way, but in the end even that thought was crushed by hunger. She was left only with the most basic instincts. I want to eat. I want to sit. I want to stay alive. Some people are not defeated. They are worn to pieces by the flight itself. At the landing point, she was quickly merged into the POW intake column. Every step felt as if she were treading on cotton. Her legs no longer obeyed her, and her vision dimmed in waves. Around her rose the warm smell from American field kitchens, meat broth, steam from boiled cabbage, the faintly burnt aroma of breadcrumbs. Her nostrils hurt as if scalded, but she did not dare glance toward the food for more than a heartbeat. She was afraid it would make her look like a beggar. But she already looked like a beggar. Hunger strips all elegance from human beings until only the drive to survive is left. At the entrance to the camp, she was forced to stand in a line for washing and delousing. Steam billowed up. Disinfectant powder stung the nose. Clippers buzzed without stopping. She wanted to stand straight, to maintain the posture drilled into her during training, but her spine ached as if it would snap, and her knees were so weak she could barely lock them. She clenched her teeth to keep from showing any sign of weakness. Even as prisoners, German soldiers were to preserve a final thread of dignity. This had been trained into her as instinct, but her body betrayed her. A sudden wave of dizziness hit. Her knees refused to lift one more time. Her surroundings spun. Just as she was about to crumple, she smelled food. Strong, simple, but miraculously real. Someone stopped in front of her. It was an American GI eating lunch. The cuffs of his uniform were faintly stained with mud. His boots were old and worn, and he still held his own lunch tray. He did not look at her. His eyes were on a still unopened piece of vitamin-fortified biscuit on his tray. In the next moment he pushed that biscuit toward her. His tone was calm, without pity, without deliberate kindness, as if he were making a gesture that needed no justification at all. She froze. The biscuit wrapper caught the light, a small reflective glint that looked like something that did not belong in her world. He said nothing, only nudged the biscuit another centimeter in her direction. That single centimeter smashed 2 full years of mental training. She had been taught about the enemy's cruelty, the enemy's deception, the enemy's humiliation. No one had ever told her that. When you are so weak, you are little more than a shadow. The enemy might push his own food toward you. Her throat burned. Her stomach felt seared. Her hand trembled, yet she forced herself not to reach out. If she stretched out her hand, she would be admitting she could no longer maintain a soldier's dignity. But she knew even more clearly, if she didn't take it, she might truly collapse. Her eyes grew damp, not from tears, but from sheer physical weakness. In the end, she lifted her hand, as if accepting a forbidden warmth. The biscuit weighed almost nothing in her palm, yet felt as if it had snapped some long, overstretched string inside her. The most dangerous thing is not kindness. It is kindness without any obvious purpose. When she swallowed the first bite, it was as if her stomach suddenly caught fire. The pain almost made her double over. In her condition, she should not have eaten solid food so quickly, but at that moment her body seemed to have finally found proof that it can still survive. She didn't dare devour it. She could only nibble off small corners, letting the crumbs dissolve slowly on her tongue. It was an unfamiliar taste. Slightly sweet, with the scent of grain and a certain sense of surplus she could not name. Bread on the German front had long been bulked out with substitutes and tasted like chewing damp paper, whereas this biscuit seemed like a signal from another world. A world that did not lack food, did not lack order, and did not even lack enough to share with the enemy. By the time she lowered her head to eat the biscuit, the American soldier had already turned and walked back to his place in the line. He did not look back, did not wait for her thanks, and showed no particular emotion about what he had done, as if this were just another part of his lunch routine. Hanna did not know his name, or why he had acted that way. She even wondered if she had imagined it. As close to fainting as she had been, any warmth might have looked like a miracle, but the dry powder of the biscuit still clung to her fingertips. The sensation was too real to be an illusion. The air at the camp entrance shifted constantly with the movement of the queue, steam, sweat, and disinfectant powder mixing together. She stood in line, the buzz of clippers so close it made her eardrums ache. When her turn came, an American servicewoman barked a few English words she didn't understand and pushed her down into the chair. Scissors and clippers went to work at the same time, hair falling in clumps onto her lap. She had no strength left to feel ashamed. The taste of the biscuit still lingered in her mouth. It was impossible to focus her attention on the humiliation of losing her braid. She had never imagined that on enemy soil, inside the enemy's procedures, she would be saved once by the enemy's food. After the clipping, she was taken to the disinfection area. White powder fell across her shoulders like snow. In that moment she felt an almost absurd lightness, not freedom, but the sense of being absorbed into a huge, stable system that carried no particular malice, a system utterly unlike the German army. When the washing was done, she received a set of coarse work clothes and an identification card. From the front of the line, a loudspeaker issued short commands in English. She could not understand them, but from the orderly rhythm of the POWS movements, she could feel that everything ran like an assembly line. No shouting, no insults, no random violence. The enemy seemed to be managing a huge factory, not locking up mortal foes. Just when she thought she would never see that soldier again, she caught sight of him from a distance near the food distribution shed. He was helping another soldier move containers of hot food, his movements practiced and efficient. Sunlight fell along his shoulder, picking out the old stains of mud on his uniform. The mud was different from what she had seen on the German front. It was not the mud of chaos and despair, but the residue of ordinary labor. She stopped for a moment without realizing it. Not because of him, but because for the first time she understood. She was able to stand because that purposeless gesture had given her a foothold. The biscuit was not merely food. It was her first point of contact with this system. She quickly lowered her head and walked on, afraid anyone would notice her reaction. German soldiers were not supposed to look at the enemy too long, nor let the enemy see their weakness. But that night, lying on the iron bunk in the barracks, her whole body aching, she could not fall asleep for a long time. When she closed her eyes, the image of the biscuit kept returning, pushed toward her, wordless, expressionless, without intent. This was the moment she ceased to be simply a German prisoner and became, for the first time, an ordinary person someone else had casually pulled back to her feet. From the next day, she was assigned to the camp's standardized routines. The clipper's rhythm was as precise as a clock. The washing area was open only at fixed times each day. The ration schedule was posted on the notice board with English words she could recognize: biscuits, milk, beans. Patrol guards recorded the weather every 3 hours, sliding small cards into a wooden box with the movements of workers rather than warriors. There were no curses in the camp, no deliberate harassment, not even the interrogations she had expected. Every procedure was carried out as procedure. No one showing her extra hostility because she was German, and no one relaxing supervision because she was a woman. She was just a number, a grain of sand evenly absorbed into this system. She began to realize that the Americans did not maintain order through hatred. They relied on a kind of stability she had never seen before. She tried to keep herself from thinking about the soldier with the biscuit, but he was the only one who had seen her close to collapsing. The biscuit was like a seam, tearing open the distance between her and this new world, a narrow rip that kept glowing faintly. The first time she saw him again in the work area was during an afternoon shift moving wooden crates. Her strength had been badly sapped by long-term malnutrition. Halfway through carrying one crate, she almost dropped it. She gritted her teeth and steadied it, and in that instant saw him standing in the shade not far away, filling out a weather report. He did not come over to help, but when she glanced up, she caught his gaze pausing briefly on the red marks the cold wind had forced out on the backs of her hands, only for a second before he looked away. That 1 second was more dangerous than the biscuit. The biscuit had been instinct. That second was attention. She lowered her head and kept moving, her heartbeat stumbling. She was not a little girl. She knew what another person's gaze could mean. She also knew that such a gaze was not allowed in a POW camp. It ran against the grain of the system. She did not know whether he meant anything by it. She knew only that the glance was too brief to form an intention, but long enough to kindle a kind of warmth that felt almost like shame. Over the next few days, she kept running into him at moments that were not supposed to carry any emotional weight at all. He passed through her work area during patrol. She saw him carrying crates in the rear while she collected tools. When her hair was being clipped too short, he stood farther back than usual, as if deliberately avoiding staring at her. When she shivered in the wind, an old coat appeared near the work table, though she was not allowed to leave her place to fetch it, meaning it must have been left there by someone in passing. She had no proof, but she could feel it. Someone was quietly watching to see whether she could hold on. This was not love, not even clearly defined kindness. It was the closest, quietest, and most dangerous kind of approach the system would allow. She began to fear this approach, because she had no idea how to protect herself from it. She had never learned how to deal with an enemy who did not see her purely as an enemy. One night, the camp loudspeaker played a program from the United States. The sound bounced off the sheet metal walls like the breath of some distant city. She lay on the iron bunk, listening to the unfamiliar music, and suddenly realized she had gone 3 days without crying and 3 days without using the phrase, "I am a German soldier," to force herself to straighten her back. The biscuit had changed her, but not because of the biscuit itself. It was because that biscuit had come from a world that did not need her hatred in order to function. That night, for the first time on enemy soil, she slept a little more peacefully. In her dreams, she was still running. But when she reached out to grasp something, it was not a weapon, nor an order. It was a small, warm thing being pushed toward her. She was assigned to light-duty work in the camp. The Americans clearly understood that her nutrition was poor and she could not handle heavy labor, so they put her on sorting crates, folding bedding, and handling recyclables. The work was not easy, but it was simpler than hauling wounded through the night in the German field hospitals. Every action here was prescribed. Every step had a reference chart. Even without understanding the words, she could complete her tasks by watching the others. This stability allowed her nerves to loosen a little for the first time. She no longer had to worry about when the next bomb would fall, whether orders would suddenly change, or whether the next meal would run out. The American system was not held together by intimidation or improvised measures. It was like a huge machine, and she was a gear within it. Safe, insignificant, but precisely accommodated. And he was like a noise that was not supposed to exist within that machine. The first time she fainted was in the afternoon. Sunlight filtered through the barbed wire, scattering mottled shadows across the ground. She was carrying a crate when her vision went black. The world lost its gravity, and her body turned to paper. The German prisoners nearby cried out, and someone grabbed her shoulder, but the grip was clumsy. Just as she thought she would fall, a hand caught her elbow, firm and steady. She looked up and saw him, the American soldier. His hand was broad and warm, a sharp contrast to the winter air. He did not seem flustered. He spoke a few words of English in a low voice. From his tone, she guessed they meant something like, "Slow down," or "Sit." He lifted his canteen to her lips with care, as if he were handling something fragile. She wanted to refuse, but her lips were cracked with pain and her tongue numb from dehydration. She could not shape a full word. In the end, she bit lightly on the canteen's rim and drank the cold water. It seemed to ignite her throat as it went down, clarity and soreness rising together into her chest. He did not go on holding her, nor did he make any unnecessary gestures. Once he was sure she was seated securely, he stepped back to a normal patrol distance. His eyes carried neither pity nor superiority, only the calm concern of someone asking, "Can this prisoner continue to work?" But in that second she knew, if not for him, she would have gone down hard. That was what made him dangerous. Not coming too close, but being exactly close enough. Never crossing the line, always stopping in the narrow gap between regulation and humanity. The next day at work, she made a conscious effort not to look at him. Yet she could not help noticing that he too was avoiding meeting her gaze. He would pass through her work area but not come nearer. He would slow his pace when she carried heavy loads, but not stop. He would patrol by her resting place but never look in her direction. This deliberate not looking was harder to ignore than a direct stare. It was not indifference, it was a deliberate maintenance of boundaries, until a cold snap in the third week quietly shifted everything. That day the wind was especially sharp, scraping the skin like shards of glass. She had been assigned to fold sheets in the yard, the fabric just in from the drying lines. Her fingers were stiff and trembling. She thought she could endure it until the skin on the back of her hand split into a thin crack, seeping blood. She drew a breath but did not make a sound, afraid someone would declare her unfit for work. Short footsteps approached. She did not look up, but heard the soft thud of something dropped by her feet. A pair of worn leather gloves. The fingers were frayed. The palms bore hard calluses worn in by carrying crates. They belonged to someone who did heavy lifting every day. To him. She froze. She did not look at him, and he did not linger. His footsteps paused for a single second. Then he resumed his normal patrol pace as if nothing had happened. She could not see his expression, only the sun-faded creases in the leather. Her throat tightened. This was neither overstepping nor an ostentatious gift. It was a silent gesture that said, "I see you are near your limit," without saying it aloud. It was a small piece of humanity slotted into the grey zone of the system. When she slipped on the gloves, her fingers were wrapped in the residual warmth of the leather, a warmth that belonged neither to him nor to her, and yet for the first time made her feel she was not invisible. From that day on, she began noticing even subtler things. His footsteps were lighter when he patrolled past her work area. His route always seemed to pass just close enough when she was carrying crates. He would signal quietly when she was about to make a mistake that might draw another guard's attention. When she did not understand an order, he would use the simplest possible gestures to indicate direction. When her hair had been clipped so short she felt stripped of identity, he kept his distance a little wider, as if preserving an unseen inch of dignity for her. None of these actions were romantic. All of them were dangerous. Dangerous because they were so reasonable, so small, so impossible to challenge. If anyone asked, he could always say he was just performing routine patrols. And she could not claim he had done anything concrete. But she knew that each of those details was another thin thread binding her to some emotion she dared not name. She had no right to feel soft toward the enemy, and no right to grow attached. But the body remembers the moment it was caught before falling, just as the starving never forget their first bite of food. One afternoon, she was sent to a small storage shed at the edge of the camp to sort tools. It was a remote corner. Wind blew through the gaps, tearing the shadows inside into ragged pieces. She bent to arrange shovels and knocked dust from a beam into her eyes. The sting almost forced tears to her cheeks. She rubbed at her eyes and heard familiar footsteps. He stood in the shed entrance, his outline blurred against the light, looking less like a soldier than an accidental passer-by. She ducked her head in haste, pretending to keep working. But the smarting in her eyes made her movements clumsy. A shovel slipped and hit the floor with a dull thud. He seemed to hesitate for a second, then took a step forward. He reached out, not to touch her, but to set a clean rag down on the table in front of her. The kind of cloth Americans use to wipe gun oil, soft, clean, far better than the coarse rags in her hands. He said nothing. She did not look up. A table, the light, and the boundary both of them knew not to cross lay between them. She heard him exhale softly, as if pressing some feeling down, then turn and leave. His footsteps receded, and only the wind through the shed remained. Her chest gave a painful jolt, not a quickening of the heart, but something in her being called back to life. That night she could not fall asleep at once. She stared at the crisscross of wire shadows above the bunk while a woman's American voice sang a song she did not know over the radio. She ran through the day's details again and again in her mind, the biscuit, the canteen, the worn gloves. Every act was the smallest unit the system allowed, yet the furthest extent humanity could reach within it. She finally understood that the real danger was not the enemy, not interrogation, not captivity. The real danger was this: someone treating you in a way you have never been treated before. It made her ask a question she had never dared to ask herself. If even the enemy is willing to see you as a living person worth taking care of, then what were the loyalty, dignity, and identity you clung to in the past really worth? She had no answer. She only knew that she was no longer the German girl dragging wounded men through the forests of Luxembourg, no longer the half-frozen number in the harbour wind. She was becoming something else. A person being seen again within the limits of what the system would allow. It was not love, but it was more real than love, more silent, and harder to bear. On the 47th day of her internment, something happened that looked trivial from the outside, but shook the very structure of Hanna's personality. That morning the weather was clear, the wind less biting, and the work not particularly hard. She had been assigned to inventory supplies in the laundry. By regulation, each prisoner was allotted a fixed quantity of soap. Bars donated by the American Red Cross were neatly stacked on the shelves, labeled with weight, batch number, and designated issue area. She followed the procedure, registered her number, received 1 bar of soap, and placed it in her assigned storage basket. The process was simple, requiring no negotiation and leaving no room for mistakes. But as she walked toward the exit, a young American guard stopped her and told her to halt. He frowned, glanced at her basket, then back at the shelves and said a few curt words in English. Hanna could not understand the words, but she could hear what they meant. He suspected she had taken more than her share. Her first reaction was not fear, but shame. Being regarded as a thief cut deeper than hunger. She shook her head at once and tried to explain in German, but her voice was too low to be heard over the clamour of the room. The guard told her to put the basket on the counter. She did so, her hands trembling. For a girl raised in the German military system, being accused of stealing was a profound disgrace, worse even than surrender. Her stomach began to cramp, as if she were once more on that muddy escape route in Luxembourg. She remembered the wounded abandoned along the way, the night's forced march through blizzards, the humiliation of being driven at gunpoint by militia. She should not have to endure such trampling again, not here, not like this. But she could not even form a coherent sentence. The guard called another soldier over to check the records. The two of them spoke in low voices, their expressions grave. Her breathing grew fast and shallow. Her chest tightened as if the air itself was squeezing her out. She suddenly realized something terrifying. If the procedure marked her as having violated regulations, her work, rations, or basic privileges could be cut. Just as the panic was about to crush her, she saw a familiar figure coming down the corridor. Him, the American soldier who had pushed the biscuit to her. He had been working another detail, but now approached without a word. He showed no agitation, no hurry, only moved in the calm, practiced way of a man on patrol. He nodded to the guard and said a few low words in English, his tone deeper and steadier than when he spoke to her. The guard's face was tight at first, but gradually relaxed as he listened. Finally, he shrugged, indicating she could go. The whole thing took only a few seconds, but it felt as if she had been pulled from the bottom of the sea back into the air. When the guard walked away, the soldier did not come closer, nor did he hint at what she ought to say. He simply stood there long enough to confirm that the basket held only one bar of soap. His eyes showed no blame, no pity, no pride in rescuing her. Only confirmation. Confirmation that she had not been judged wrongly, that the system had not harmed her. For the first time, she realized she had never really understood American order. In the German army, identity, rank, and attitude affected the outcome. Here, the procedure itself decided the outcome, and people were only components used to carry it out. He was just another component, but at that moment he had become her guardrail, not because of who she was, but because the procedure allowed him to act, and within that allowance he chose to be a slightly softer part of the machine. In that instant, her identity finally crumbled, not because of hunger nor capture, but because she realized she was no longer an Oberschützer of the German Wehrmacht. She was simply a person who needed the protection of the system and deserved that protection. Back in the barracks, she sat on the iron bunk and traced the edges of the soap with her fingers, so gently it was as if she were touching something forbidden. It was just an ordinary bar of soap, faintly scented, plainly wrapped, yet nothing Germany had ever issued her had made her feel so secure. She spoke to no one that night, only stared at the fine scratches on the backs of her hands in the lamplight. Those marks had been left by flight, hunger, and cold, and now here she was, in a place of strict rules and clear procedures without malice, trembling again because of a misunderstanding. She suddenly understood. What she feared was not punishment, but being misjudged. Misjudged as the kind of person who steals. That would mean she was not even worth being seen clearly. But he had spoken up for her. A few brief words in English had brought her back into the order. It was not the beginning of love. It was the first moment of trust. As time went on, she began to observe the camp in a different way. She noticed the fixed weekly quantities brought in by the ration trucks. Noticed that the guards' shifts were changed down to the minute. Noticed that broadcasts from the United States always played once before sunset. Noticed that the extra rations came like clockwork every Friday. Noticed that the weather cards were always slotted neatly into the same wooden box. Noticed that the clippers and tools in the barber station were disinfected at the same time daily. Noticed that everyone, American or prisoner, was caught and held by this rhythm so that no one fell completely through. This was a world in which no one was simply thrown away. A world she had never known. The German army had given her loyalty, but never safety. The American system did not give her love. It gave her the shelter of order. She lay on her bunk with her eyes closed, listening to the gentle female voice on the radio, each sentence falling into her like a language she had never been taught. Order is more stable than compassion, and colder than hostility. For the first time she understood. It was not before the biscuit that her heart had wavered. It was at the moment she was protected by the system that she was completely changed. Spring came sooner than expected. The land around the camp loosened in March. The wind carried the smell of grass and damp earth. The radio played more programs from the homeland now, sometimes even recordings of children's laughter. For the prisoners, these sounds were remote and strange, like a world that had nothing to do with them and yet waited somewhere in the future. To Hanna, they meant something she had never allowed herself to imagine: the possibility of peace. News from the closing stages of the war arrived constantly. One afternoon, a new order was posted on the notice board. Repatriation procedures were ready to begin. By regulation, she would be sent back to Europe within weeks, after proper paperwork, medical checks, and assignment to a returning convoy, She would board a transport ship home. She stared at the paper, her fingertips cold. She had thought she would feel lightness, anticipation, even relief, but what swept through her was only a voiceless blank. She realized she had to leave. Leave this regular, safe place where she would not starve. Leave the figure she had tried so hard not to look at, but could not ignore. That night she tossed in her bunk after lights out, listening to the footsteps of the guard shift outside. The iron frame creaked softly like a tired sigh. She thought of the first biscuit, the old gloves, the hand that had steadied her arm while he passed her the canteen. Those moments were like torn fragments, like pages blown by the wind. No confessions, no forbidden conversations, yet all lodged deep in her memory. She did not dare name what it was. To name it would be betrayal. But to leave it unnamed would mean losing it all over again. She was caught in a paradox, to stay here or to return to the country that had abandoned her. From the next day, her work hours were gradually reduced so she could undergo the checks and paperwork required for repatriation. While she waited in line at the registration office, she saw him once outside on the camp road. The sun fell along his shoulder. His step was steady, but his eyes did not move an inch toward where she was standing. That was not coldness. It was restraint. The last possible distance allowed by the rules. Whatever lay between them could not and must not be allowed to crystallize into anything explicit. The regulations pressed around them like the air itself, making approach impossible and retreat painful. After her final medical check before repatriation, she walked back alone toward the barracks. Passing a corner of the kitchen, she stopped. Steam clouded the air. The smell of baking bread made her chest ache. For the first time, she realized she was about to lose these smells, these sounds, this world guarded by order. The heartbreaking truth was this. It was in the enemy camp that she had first learned what safety meant. The day of departure came quietly. The weather was fine, the sky so clear it seemed to belong to a world where war had never existed. The prisoners were led in groups to the assembly point, each given a repatriation bag containing the bare minimum of belongings. Hanna accepted hers. It was so light it might have been empty. Her name was called, and she was told to stand in the third row. The columns were neat and silent. The atmosphere strangely solemn. Not fear, not excitement, but the feeling of sealing away an entire chapter of life. Then she saw him. He stood at the edge of the assembly ground, half in light and half in shadow. Not approaching, not saying goodbye, just patrolling his assigned route. That was the place the system allowed him to stand, the only place. She did not turn her head, did not pause, did not give anyone any chance to notice anything amiss. She simply walked forward, each step feeling as if it landed on the verge of something about to break. As the column neared the transport trucks, every prisoner had to undergo a final check of belongings. A guard ordered her to place her repatriation bag on the table so he could verify its contents conformed to regulations. She obeyed, opening the bag. The guard bent to compare it with a list, then frowned slightly. Inside the bag, there was an extra biscuit. Not an ordinary biscuit, but the familiar, neatly wrapped, square, vitamin-fortified biscuit. She stared at it, her mind blank. Not because of the biscuit itself, but because it could not possibly have found its way in on its own. The guard glanced up at her, seeming about to ask something, but quickly bent his head again. He probably thought it was an issuing error or that some other worker had placed it there by mistake. After all, a single biscuit was insignificant in this process, not worth investigating. When the inspection was done, she was waved onward. As she picked up the bag, the biscuit shifted with a faint rustle inside. She did not look back. She could not allow herself to look at him even once, because they both knew. This was the only thing he could give her, and it was the furthest he could go beyond the limits of the rules. She climbed into the truck and sat on the cold metal bench, hugging the bag to her chest. The engine roared, the vehicle shuddered slightly, and the air smelled of oil and dust. Someone was crying. Someone else was praying in a low voice. Others murmured the names of German towns. She said nothing, only reached slowly into the bag and took out the biscuit. The wrapper was as clean as on the day she had first received one. Her fingertips stroked the faint roughness of the paper. It was not a confession, not a promise, not a plea to stay. It was not even much of a keepsake. Yet it was the only true piece of gentleness she had received on enemy soil, the only true confirmation, the only proof that she had been seen. The truck pulled away, the barbed wire sliding backward. She did not cry, and did not crane her head for a last look. But she held the biscuit tightly in her palm, as if holding a final, unspoken answer. The familiar female voice came over the radio. Wind pushed in through the cracks in the truck's canvas, stirring her short hair. Suddenly she understood. She had not fallen in love with him. She had fallen in love with the humanity that order still allowed to exist, with a world that did not need her hatred, did not demand her loyalty, and only required that she remain alive. She left the camp with that biscuit, and took with her something she had never possessed before, a sense that even in the darkest war, there was still a possibility of being treated gently. The war had cost her her homeland, her identity, and her past, but the enemy's order had given her a new way to live. Not freedom, not love, something more precious, the dignity of being regarded as a human being. As the convoy rolled away from the camp, sunlight fell across her face. She closed her eyes and drew a deep breath. The biscuit lay quiet in her palm, like a tiny mark left by fate. It reminded her. Her world had already changed, and there was no going back.